Greetings. May grace and peace be unto you. I'm an apostle of the Lord Jesus Christ. I come to you in a spirit of humility, which is, oddly enough, the topic that I wish to discuss with you today. If I were to entitle today's sermon, it would be Humility, Thinking of Yourself Less. I began this piece at night, and I found many scriptures on humility or humble. I was stunned at the number of times the Lord used the word humble. A few years ago, I was talking to a friend of mine on the phone, and the topic of humility came up. She was in a Bible study group, and the topic for that evening was humility. The man who was teaching said, "Humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less." In other words, in order to be humble, don't put yourself down. Think more often of other people. Lift other people up. What it means to be humble in God's eyes is to be submissive. Now, I realize that word has a negative connotation in our society. We're a proud culture, and we do not fear to show it. Being proud of who we are as a people and a nation is something that has been ingrained in us from the very beginning. We're taught the Pledge of Allegiance in the first grade, and we recite it every morning for 12 years. It's shown in the media, more so now that 9/11 has happened. We have peers who seem to grasp that concept faster than we, and we see it in them. Peer pressure and an inwardly innate drive as we as humans have to be proud all funnels together to create a nation of overly proud people. Something to keep in the back of your mind is that pride is the root of all sin. All of it. No matter what you do, you can trace it back to pride. For example, I have a few statements here that will exemplify what certain sins are and how they can be taken back to pride. First one is one that I've had to deal with, is gluttony. There's nothing wrong with me. I can eat as much as I want. I can't be hurt by food. Or vanity. There's nothing wrong with me. I shouldn't have been denied that promotion at work. I'm just as good as that moron. Or, finally, wrath. And I'm certain this is something all of you can attest to. You're driving to church in the morning and you get cut off. And instantly you snap into rage. It's like, did you see what he did? The insert word here, cut me off. I can't believe he did that. To me, of all people. Can't you see that I'm on my way to church? It all comes back to pride. Proverbs 16:18. Pride cometh before disaster, and arrogance, a haughty spirit cometh before the fall. Keep that on one side. We're going to go somewhere else, and we'll come back to that. Humility is being submissive. Not submissive to the point of being a doormat or other things, but knowing your place in the kingdom and in life. Remember, whether you know your place or not, He does, and He will show it to you. And He'll use very effective measures to show it to you, not just speaking to you verbally. The book of Judges gives us several accounts of how this is accomplished. Judges 2:11 begins the story of the Israel's rises and falls from grace. Judges 3:7-11. The Israelites did things that the Lord saw as evil. They forgot the Lord. They served the Baals and the Asherahs. The Lord became very angry with Israel and gave them over to King Cushan of Aram. The Israelites served Cushan for 8 years, but then they cried out to the Lord. So the Lord raised a deliverer for the Israelites, Othniel, Kenaz's son, Caleb's younger brother. Caleb is one of the spies, one of the 12 spies that were sent to Jericho under Joshua. Verse 10, the Lord's Spirit was with Othniel, and he led Israel. When he marched out for war, the Lord handed Aram's king Cushan over to him. Othniel overpowered Cushan, and the land was peaceful for 40 years, until Othniel, Kenaz's son, died. We continue forward. Judges 3:12-30 tells about Ehud, another judge, and the tail end of chapter 3, verse 31, mentions Shamgar. Judges 4 and 5 recount the tale of Deborah. Judges 6-8 is Gideon, the man who took 300 warriors and were not armed but had broken pots, a trumpet, and a torch. There's all kinds of symbolism and fun things in there, but we're not going to get into that. Judges 10 is Tola and Jair. These are all judges, by the way. 11 and 12 is the story of Jephthah, which is an interesting name. And finally, Judges 13 through 16 is Samson. You all know the story of Samson. If you don't, in a small valley there was a man named Manoah whose wife was sterile. She was faithful, she was a good servant, and God decided to bless her with a son. However, there were some conditions. He was to be a Nazirite, which means that he was one of God's own people. He was very important to God. He was set aside even within the Israelites and the Levites. The conditions were for Samson that he could never shave his head, he could never touch anything uncooked, like anything raw or dead, and several other things. The Lord blessed him with extreme superhuman strength. And no matter what situation he found himself in, he could use that strength to get out of it. Even when his friends betrayed him and bound him, gave him to the Philistines, he snapped the ropes and killed them all. Granted, he did it with the jawbone of the donkey, but hey, the rest of Judges is an account of what happened in the Promised Land until the time of Ruth. But each and every account that I had just read was a season of time where Israel walked away and came back. Walked away and came back. God was trying to get them to see how important it was to stay where you belong in the kingdom. Israel's place was to be was to be in the Promised Land as a shining beacon to other countries around them. They couldn't eat pork. They were circumcised. They had other dietary restrictions. They had all these things that would set them apart from the other nations around them. A good, for instance, is all of the nations around them were polytheistic. That means they had more than one God. However, the Israelites only had one. That was Yahweh. And of course, they didn't get it. But each generation would attempt to instill the beliefs that they had into the children that came after them. But it just wouldn't take. And I know why it didn't take. Because Satan. And that makes me angry. Satan uses the innate pride of the children of Israel to blind them to God's law and love. Each and every time the Hebrews went astray, God went to them and brought them back. This would work well for a time, and then the defenses would falter and evil could enter. This happened 8 different times. Each and every time, God would come and help them. The need for one strong leader presented itself, but they stopped trusting in God for their leadership. Now, why they did that is beyond me. I mean, He led them out of Israel with a flaming torch, with a flaming cloud going in front of them. No matter what obstacle they encountered, God was able to overcome it. Of course, God's able to overcome anything. For Crimony's sake, when they had to fight, and Moses was still their leader, as long as Moses kept his arms up, they were winning. It was one of those, you've seen all this stuff, and you don't get it? I mean, how much more plain do you want it to be? The need for strong leadership continued to arise. So, God thought, okay, how can I make this work? Oh, simple. I'll call people, they'll call prophets. These people were Samuel, Nathan, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, Daniel, and Ezekiel. Just to name a few. There were many, many more. But like their peers, they can see things they perceive they lack. Thus, they asked for a king. King Saul and David and his line. They were once again trying to separate themselves from the calling that they had in the kingdom. That shining beacon. Now, instead of having a group or an army of foreigners cause them pain and grief, God told them that someone from their own people would do that. But they didn't care. They were acting like children, wanting what their friends had. This continued on and on, through the good kings and the bad, which leads us to the time of King Josiah, the last good king of Judah, which is the primary focus of the Bible in that time. This idea makes sense because Jesse of Bethlehem was from the tribe of Judah. And that's also where we get the phrase Lion of the tribe of Judah. That's Jesus. After Josiah's death, the people began their biggest faux pas yet. It was so bad that Isaiah was able to prophesy about it at least 150 years earlier. And what he said was accurate to the T. The nation began to turn away, and instead of taking one step forward and one step back, The whole nation took several giant steps away and didn't look back. And God pulled back their covering, let the enemy, called Assyria, attack, which ordinarily would cause those steps to return, but this time it didn't. The southeastern, I'm not positive on that one, it didn't say. The southeastern gate was breached, and the trees along the road were pulled up. Satan and his minion nation Assyria were able to get a sucker punch in. And instead of calling God once again, once their heads stopped reeling, instead of calling God, they responded in defiance. When it began, this is a quote from a book called The Harbinger, and I'll get into that in just a moment. When it began, they were still using God's name, but with less and less meaning behind it. They began to merge him with the gods of the nations. They began turning from him, subtly at first, then outright, then brazenly, driving him out of their national life and bringing in idols to fill the void. The land became covered with idols and altars to foreign gods. They rejected their covenant, abandoned their standards, and exchanged their values for those they had never known. Spirituality for sensuality, holiness for profanity, righteousness for self-interest. I won't go into the specifics for time's sake, but you can read what you can. Isaiah 9:10 tells the prophecy. Also, if any of you have read that book I mentioned, The Harbinger, it will explain all of this. This was the biggest act of pride and defiance the Israelite people had ever made, which is surely why, thereafter, the entire country of Judah was dispersed into Babylon. 2,500 years later, another nation made the same faux pas. Care to take a guess who that is? That's right, it's us. We've messed up royale. All because of pride. We have allowed abominations like homosexuality and adultery, deceit and pornography, which is also known as lust, to run rampant in our country. Not to mention the whole forgetting God and making others to put in his place thing. For example, money, fashion, celebrity, sports, and pretty much anything else that can be put in place of God.